Good evening and welcome to the ICAS Summer Symposium Libertas 2021. I'm Shinja Kim, President and Chair of ICAS, and thank you for joining our program today on the topics related to the Korean Peninsula issues. And it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker, Professor Andrei Lankov. It's so good to see you, Andrei. Welcome. Professor Lankov was born in Leningrad and now St. Petersburg. He completed both of his undergraduate and graduate studies at Leningrad State University, PhD in 1989. In 1996 to 2004, Andrei taught Korean history at Australia National University, and since 2004, he teaches at Kookmin University in Seoul at the College of Social Studies. Andrei's major research interest is North Korean history and society. His major English language publications on North Korea include From Stalin to Kim Il-sung, The Formation of North Korea 1945 to 1960, Crisis in North Korea, Rogers University Press 2003, The Failure of De-Stalinization in 1956, University of Hawaii Press 2004, North of the DMZ, Essays and Daily Life in North Korea, McFarlane and Company 2007, and The Real North Korea, Oxford University Press 2013. Also, he contributed his articles to various press organizations, including Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, Newsweek, and he published many academic articles as well. In 2017, the Foreign Policy magazine included him into the list of global thinkers. Today, we are delighted to have Professor Lankov as our speaker and hope you enjoy the program. And please join me welcoming Professor Lankov. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for inviting me, because it's a great honor to do presentation in such an audience. And in, say, 20 minutes I've been given for introductory remarks, I would like to briefly talk about what can and what cannot be done in and with North Korea, with special emphasis on the so-called nuclear issue. You know, I have been watching North Korea and developments around North Korea for, well, roughly 37 years by now. 37 years. And over the last 25 years, starting from the, say, mid-1990s, maybe even early 1990s, that is 3 decades by now, I cannot resist the feeling that I am watching a sort of soap opera. You know, one of these lengthy TV dramas, probably from Southern America, where they have so many highly repetitive episodes. What is happening now is very similar to what happened 5 and 10 and 15 years ago. You can easily predict the twists because you have seen these twists so many times. And today I would like not to concentrate on small issues, like, say, are North Koreans going to talk or not? What will be the results of Sun Kim visit to Seoul? What will be the attitude of the Japanese to possible deal, and so on and so on. Because, you know, once again, I have seen it for 30 years, and I have seen these small features, which are so favorable with the diplomats and journalists. These features are not really significant. I would like to talk about long-term trends. First, I think that the nuclear issue has no solution. Basically, the last time when it could be solved, if by solution we mean denuclearization, last moment was probably 20 years ago. And even then, I'm not so sure. The North Korean leaders believe that they need nuclear weapons for their survival. You cannot bribe them into doing what they see as a sort of suicide, and they do see denuclearization as suicide. You cannot even blackmail them, because, once again, if they give in to the blackmail, they believe themselves to be doomed. Actually, the North Korean nuclear weapons serve at least three major goals. On one hand, they still dream about unification of Korea under their control. They dream about driving Americans from the peninsula and essentially taking control over the South. But I would dare to say that for many years, actually for decades, it has been just a dream. Something they would not mind, but they don't consider it seriously. It's not the major reason why they are developing nuclear weapons. The second function of nuclear weapon is of course, diplomatic tool. Something they can use for their own diplomatic blackmail. Something which is very useful to squeeze concessions from their negotiating partners. And they have made full use of it. However, right now they probably are not in a terrible need of foreign aid, largely because of Sino-American confrontation, the Cold War 2.0, which, as we are going to talk about, is extremely important for the future of North Korea, for what's going to happen in North Korea. Then, what else? Major function of the nuclear weapons, I would say, to act as deterrent, to make sure that they are not going to be attacked, because they are afraid. They are afraid, and their fear has some reasons. They have seen what happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and above all, they see what happened in Libya. I believe the Libyan events were of special importance, because what happened in Libya is actually the worst nightmare of people who are running North Korea. As you know, in the early 2000s, the then ruler of Libya, Colonel Gaddafi, agreed to make a deal. It's remarkable that the conditions he accepted were very similar to the conditions North Koreans have been proposed. And in an interesting and curious coincidence, even one of the major players in both cases was the same person, Ambassador John Bolton. Libyan government under Gaddafi accepted the proposal, and they essentially surrendered their half-baked nuclear weapons acquisition program. Wonderful. They got economic benefits, sanctions were lifted, everything was fine. And then revolution began. And when a popular revolution began inside Libya, significant part of the Libyans still were sort of supported of Gaddafi regime, almost definitely minority, but still a noticeable minority. And he had control over the military. He could use his air superiority to make a bloodbath of all cities and towns and villages whose population supported rebels and were providing soldiers and ammunition and support to the revolutionary armies. Had he done it, he probably would win. Not necessary, but he had a good fighting chance. But the NATO countries intervened, and citing a responsibility to protect principle, they prevented Libyan government from using its major advantage. As a result, Gaddafi was killed, regime collapsed. For North Korea, it was a good lesson, and it's not incidental that the North Korean media made it quite clear that North Korea should learn from the bitter experience of Libya. The North Korean leaders, as I have said, believe that without nuclear weapons, they will become vulnerable not so much for the foreign attack, even though they are afraid of a foreign attack, but to a combination of the domestic unrest and foreign attack. So they are not going to compromise on the North Korean. They are not going to compromise. They are not going to swap their relative security of being a de facto nuclear power for some kind of economic benefits. The expectations for sanctions are equally misleading. Why? Because we have seen a great deal of literature on how sanctions work. Ideally, sanctions make life of the decision makers, of the top elite, sufficiently uncomfortable. The dictator, basically due to the sanctions, cannot reward their loyalty with some kind of material benefits. To put it mildly, a dictator is running out of perks. So his generals, who used to drink Hennessy cognac and drive Porsche, have to survive on basically local liquor and Toyotas. So they have no choice. Well, but it's clear that they become unsatisfied about this government, and there are chances. Study of many precedents of many cases has demonstrated we are talking about probabilities still. It's not always happening, but sometimes the generals and the top officials begin to exercise pressure on their decision maker, on the dictator, demanding to change policy line, or maybe start thinking about changing the dictator. But it's not going to work in North Korea. Why? Because North Korea is a very unusual state in one regard. The North Korean ruling elite faces a type of threat which has never, which you will not never, but which is very difficult to find in the modern world. It used to be quite common centuries ago. That is, the threat to the very existence of their state. Because if you look at, say, revolutionary changes in other countries, revolutionary changes which very often result in a complete change, transformation of the foreign policy as well, we can see something interesting. As a cynical French journalist said almost 200 years ago in France, which was back then the place where revolutions were happening every couple of decades, he said, every revolution means 10,000 new jobs. And he was talking good jobs, official jobs. Indeed, if we look at the revolutionary changes, we usually see that under the new regime, many people who keep significant positions are people who used to keep significant positions, usually of lower level, but still very significant under the old regime. And the recent collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, well, not recent, already 30 years, is another confirmation. If we look at people who are running the post-Soviet states, on East European post-communist states, we will see that most of them used to work in the Communist Party bureaucracy, or in the secret police, or in the military, or in the state economy management, everywhere. Very few outsiders. And it's applicable not only to Russia, but to countries which are seen normally as very pro-Western. It's understandable. The old elite had connections, experience, education, and above all control over property. So, when the system was changed, not least because the elite in these countries, post-Soviet countries, East European countries, were not happy about the old communist system and their policies, well, these people stayed in power. But it's not going to happen in North Korea. And the North Korean, well, movers and shakers, the North Korean elite, is perfectly aware of it. The major problems are created by the existence of the South, which is so rich and so successful. Even if you believe that North Koreans own estimates of their per capita GDP, estimates they basically provided to the Japanese in 2018, well, their per capita GDP is about $1,200. South Korea's per capita GDP is about $31,000. 25-fold difference. The largest difference in per capita GDP, or for that matter income and living standards, between two countries which share a land border, and it's grossly destabilizing. We saw how East German state was basically crushed by much smaller difference in GDP. Because this difference in income, it creates a massive political pressure on a poor state and its elite. Because you can say, and what about China? China was doing reforms and everything, and people are aware about prosperity of the outside world, but we have not seen a Chinese revolution and unlikely to see it anytime soon. You are right. But there was a big difference between China and North Korea. Reforms and especially openness in in China, were possible because of one simple reason. There is no southern China. There is no southern China. Because Chinese are aware about prosperity of the outside world. But for the Chinese, it's a prosperity of foreign countries. If North Korean government loses control over the situation, the North Korean people will learn about prosperity of the South Koreans, who are officially considered to be a part of the same nation. And as I have mentioned, we have seen in East and West Germany how it's likely to end. This is the reason why the North Korean elite is so serious about keeping country under control and keeping country isolated. Because together with nuclear weapons, self-isolation policy is another condition of survival. But what is even more important, if we have regime collapse, it's likely to be followed by unification with the South. Just because South is so attractive, just because South Korea is so damn rich. And if such unification happens, the present-day North Korean leaders have no chances to do what, say, the Russian Communist Party era leaders or East European leaders did. They cannot suddenly claim that they have always been closet Democrats and supporters of the market economy. It's impossible. Why? Because if you have unification, the South Koreans will come. In a unified country, the old North Korean elite will have very few chances to remain in control. In case of unification, in a unified Korea, capitalism will be built by resident managers dispatched from the south by LG and Samsung and Hyundai, not by their former party secretaries or secret police operatives, like it happened in many other post-communist countries. These people understand, because of division, they live in a very unstable society. They cannot afford openness, they have to keep their country isolated, and they cannot afford to be soft on people, like it or not. But a North Korea, which has the level of human rights respect similar to the level of the present-day China, such a North Korea is not going to survive. So, these people also understand that if situation ends in collapse, regime collapse, there will be unification with the South Korea, exactly because such unification is what the majority of the common North Koreans, not elite North Koreans, but common North Koreans, are likely to demand. Maybe these people will be soon disappointed about the results, but at first they will demand it, and it will be impossible not to accept this demand. So, for the North Korean leaders, regime collapse is basically a disaster. And it means that regime survival, and this means that they should avoid everything which will make them vulnerable to domestic disturbances. and as a Libyan experience, as well as many other experiences has demonstrated, if they surrender nukes, if people one day get out of control and start demanding something, it will be difficult or impossible for the North Korean elite to restore order, which means their domination. So, to make sure that no outside force will get involved in a possible crisis, they need nuclear weapons. And without nuclear weapons, it will be not difficult but impossible to stay in power. So their logic is simple. Because they are riding a hungry tiger of the North Korean population, which is very difficult to control potentially in the long run, they really need nuclear weapons as a way to make sure that outside forces will not get involved with their domestic development. Because otherwise, any kind of domestic unrest will provoke sort of foreign involvement, and it will be quite difficult for them to do anything when everybody will be basically demanding them to stop machine gunning demonstrations or carpet bombing some villages which did not support Kim family strong enough. So they need nuclear weapons, and for them it's a question of survival. They are not going to believe any kind of promises. On one hand, they remember very well what happened to Ukraine, which in 1994 was given guarantees of its territorial integrity in case it would surrender its nuclear weapons. Back then, Ukraine had some nuclear weapons since the days of the Soviet Union. Ukrainians back in the early 1990s did worry about Crimea, whose population was overwhelmingly pro-Russian and definitely not happy about being part of Ukraine. So they did care about their territorial integrity, and they got a promise with 3 countries acting as guarantors of their territorial integrity, that is United States, United Kingdom and Russia. But everybody knows what happened in 2014, 2 decades later, when essentially Russians used a local crisis and to take over Crimea with massive support of the local population. And, well, nothing happened. All these promises were basically, well, hardly was the paper they were written on. And North Koreans have seen it. And North Koreans cannot accept all this, system, stability guarantees, security guarantees, and everything. As a matter of fact, if you read what the North Korean official media, including KCNA, their wire agency, wrote after Libya, they said explicitly, it's just the end of Gaddafi was another proof that you cannot believe all these promises. So these people are determined to remain nuclear, because without nuclear, they are afraid of foreign attacks, they are afraid of domestic disturbances, they feel helpless, and they are probably helpless. Of course, in the past, the pro-sanction group pinned some hope on essentially economic pressure. Once again, I think it was not big. Yes, North Korea, in an example I mentioned, in some authoritarian regime, if generals cannot get their Hennessy cognac and Porsche, they become unhappy. But in North Korea, people who matter, they are certain that alternative to the current situation is probably regime collapse, and they probably will survive on their Toyotas and soju, because alternative is to lose everything and maybe even become go to prison for their involvement with real or alleged human rights abuses under the Kim family regime. So these people are determined to stay in power, and they see nuclear weapons as one of important conditions of them staying in power, and they are not going to believe in sweet talk from any country, United States, South Korea, name it, not least because, by the way, these countries are democratic and they change line quite frequently, but, well, they have since enough not to be basically too credulous. Having said that, basically the conclusion is simple. North Korea is going to stay nuclear, full stop. Sanctions will not work, especially now, I began to talk about it because what has changed with sanctions? The sanctions would never work, but now their impact will be even lower because of China. China was briefly supporting the US line on North Korea, but now, with a new Cold War between the United States and China, China has serious reasons to maintain North Korea as a strategic buffer zone. The Chinese don't want unification of Korea. Chinese don't want any kind of chaos in Korea. So it means that they will be willing to support North Korea on certain level, very basic level. I would say it's a bit like social welfare benefit payments, some kind of just basic survival to make sure that no famine will break out in North Korea. But it will be probably enough for North Koreans for the time being. So they have Chinese support and Chinese, I would say, welfare benefits. And even without it, they would be probably unwilling to make concessions even under great pressure. And they are not interested in all these promises of riches because, a dead man cannot be a rich man. And they believe that if they surrender nukes, it's just a question of time because they will lose everything. Does it all mean that negotiations with North Koreans are useless? Definitely not. Because we just have to change our kind of optics, to change the goals. Denuclearization is not possible. Full stop. North Korea is going to remain nuclear power as long as the Kim family or its successors stay in control. Full stop. But it's still possible to negotiate some kind of partial agreement, more or less along the line of the Hanoi deal, which didn't go through, and was probably a good idea for the Americans to reject North Korean proposals in Hanoi because North Koreans were giving too little and were demanding too much. Having said that, the idea of swapping some research and development and manufacturing facilities involved with nuclear weapons production and maybe ICBM production, swapping it for partial lifting and relaxation of the sanctions, it's the idea, it's a way to go. And I'm pretty sure that sooner or later such a deal will be worked out. Right now, neither side is in a hurry to do it, but if we are going to talk about nuclear weapons, well, the only solution is to have not denuclearization deal, but an arms control deal. Such a deal is not going to be popular. It will be a hard sell for any US administration. I know it. And it's one of the reasons why it's not going to happen anytime soon. However, once again, the alternative is not denuclearization, but alternative is North Korea having more ICBM and better ICBMs. So basically, I would say that future is, well, if you like, Hanoi deal, or what a long time ago, more than 10 years ago, Dr. Hacker suggested. He described it as 3 no's. No more nukes, no better nukes, no proliferation, as a condition of deal, which would again implicitly accept North Korea as a de facto nuclear power. I know it sounds bad, but the problem is that I don't see alternative. Unfortunately, policy is seldom a choice between good and bad. It's usually a choice between bad and worse. Again, I'm not saying that you should not try to get rid of the North Korean nuclear weapons. We just should understand the chances of success are very low. Personally, I would say 0. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andrei. Now the floor is open. First question goes to Bruce Pentel.
Hello, Andrei. It's very nice to see you again, and always good to hear your assessments and judgments because they're so well thought out. My question involves the impact of COVID on everything you've been talking about. In your opinion, how has COVID affected government and society in North Korea, particularly when it comes to what you were talking about today, government decision-making as it relates to WMD, development, deployment, and proliferation? Thank you.
Yeah, I sort of intentionally I chose not to talk about COVID because I believe that it's a not long-term problem. It's a problem for a few years, and I was talking about decades. But it can become very explosive because I would say that North Koreans are overreacting. I get some stories from North Korea through different, and these stories are nearly comical. Like ban to play snowballs last winter because snow might contain COVID. Acting ban, no, it was efficiently enforced across the country. Uh, Ban for people living near the coast to approach the coast because stuff washed away on the shore can be contaminated. Claims to a senior Western diplomat, I just learned it last week, that North Korea should minimize all air traffic because tires of airplanes are probably contaminated, and so on. And I'm not sure whether you have noticed, but some people have definitely noticed. I discovered it myself yesterday. No, just sort of overlooked. I may be wrong. Maybe no, other people didn't overlook it. We got another Chinese custom statistics, and basically early this year, the official trade between North Korea and China was zero. Then it began to recover, and in April it was million US, which is roughly one tenth the normal pre-calculation 10%, but still was good compared to zero. But in May, it went back times. It's 2.7, $2.8 million. I have suspicion that this trade does not include some food shipment, which are definitely taking place. Nonetheless, this statistic is not completely empty, and for me the best explanation is that in April, North Korean government was probably serious about restarting trade with China. They began to do it. They even created some disinfection facilities, the largest in Sinaju. We can see it on the satellite pictures. It's quite impressive large facility. However, due to some reasons, they suddenly decided that it was not going to be safe, and they decided to backpedal. So, if there is, I think that there is one problem with COVID. North Koreans are afraid, are overreacting. They are really afraid that COVID would get in, and I'm inclined to believe, by the way, that they really don't have any significant number of COVID cases. Maybe they have had few isolated cases, but hardly more. However, they are basically have frozen their economy. They are even reluctant to get Chinese aid because they're afraid that aid can be contaminated and it might be very dangerous. And however, sooner or later, maybe next year, not this year probably, they will start getting enough doses for vaccination, maybe through COVAX, maybe through other kind of joint projects, and things will probably go back to normal. Right now, I cannot rule out even a minor outbreak of famine, not because they cannot get food, but because they don't want it, because they are so overreacting. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrei. Bruce Bennett.
Thank you. Good to talk to you, Andrei.
Yeah.
Question for you. I look at the closure of the border and I wonder if there's not something else going on there. Could it be that Kim Jong-un is really upset with all of the market economy and the people getting wealthy enough to bribe officials? And he's trying to shut a lot of that down. If there's no trade, those people go bankrupt. And then he loses all that inability he has to control this society.
Yes and no, because he definitely doesn't like his father. But it looks that he
basically goes the way of his father. Back in 2011, he was a young rebel, I would say a rebellious young dictator, full of brilliant ideas. Frank Sinatra songs on the Pyongyang setters, everything you remember. And now he is basically like many young rebels. As he ages, he is getting more and more like his father. And what you described was essentially his father's problem. Because Kim Jong-il oscillated, Kim Jong-il was sort of uncertain about growth of private economy, so he oscillated between supporting the private economy, suppressing private economy, and pretending that private economy does not exist. I'm talking about Kim Jong-il. And it looks like that Kim Jong-un is at the same cycle. He is basically in his father's 2005 stage. I do agree. But I'm slightly optimistic talking about market. Because without market economy, North Korean economy cannot function. If you read, they made these new 5-year plans, which is, well, classified everything. I have not read the new plan. I have read old plan, which is also classified. And I would describe the old plan, when I had an opportunity to read this paper, I mean old 5-year plan, 2016-2020 plan, as a combination of a horror movie and the first part, which is basically introducing the situation in the economy, which is remarkably frank, really frank. And, some kind of utopian novel, which was second part explaining where they were going to be in 2020. I believe that the current plan should be no different. So what I would say, very soon in a few years' time, Kim Jong-un will discover that he cannot do without these rich people whom he probably indeed, and he will probably find a couple of ministers to be executed as American and Japanese spies who allegedly created all these problems, like poor Park Nam-gi. Another interesting internal document I have read, it was a long expose of Park Nam-gi information, recruited in 1950s when he was studying in Czechoslovakia. Anyway, so a couple of the ministers in the North Korean government will be proclaimed to be spies, and then, well, they will be officially responsible, held responsible for all these anti-market policies, and he will go back, because it's exactly what his father did. So I will say now we are in the year 2005 situation. In due time we will be in 2010. Maybe he will do something as stupid as currency reform. They tried, and in 2009 and through, basically, maybe not. Maybe he will come back to his senses earlier. So it's basically, yes, he wants it. Yes, he is accelerating it. And I used to be very optimistic about future of North Korean economic reform, and unfortunately, I'm much less optimistic now. Because had I been in his shoes, I would do economic reforms. I would remain very brutal, very oppressive with population. I would keep country isolated, but at the same time, I would encourage people to make money. I would give them only one freedom to make money. And I would torture and kill them in large numbers if they try to ask for any other freedom. And probably it means that I would survive long enough. I probably should control my diet too, but I would survive long enough to give power to one of my children.
Thank you, Andrei. Sean Kramer.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Very interesting talk, and I definitely learned a lot from this morning here in Korea. And my question is North Korean communism has been highly dogmatic over the years, but it has evolved to the individual agency of each leader. What are your thoughts on where and how the revolution may evolve into the future? You kind of touched on it in your talk, but where do you see Kim Jong-un evolving over the next, say, 10 or 15 years?
I don't know, because I would answer this question with great certainty a couple of years ago. Now everything I used to believe is under doubt. First, I will tell you, basically, I believe that actually, when I was replying the previous question by Mr. Bennett, I already said he's increasingly like his father. Because until recently, it did look like as if Kim Jong-un was going to create a system which I would describe as reforms without openness. That is, keeping North Korean population under tough control, but also letting individuals to do free economic activity, earning money, making money. It was a kind of North Korean edition of Deng Xiaoping China, wrapped in all this old rhetoric, combination of communism and nationalism, but actually very, I would say, as capitalist as Victorian England in some regards, because China, well, it's nice to say it's communist, and communist when it comes to politics, official ideology, but when it comes to economy and social life, it's deadly kind of cutthroat capitalist system, China. So I expected something like that to emerge, but recently, over the last few years, Kim Jong-un has begun to execute a U-turn, and he is backrolling all these changes. So what I would say, most likely, I would say, expect, we are going to see the same oscillations as we saw under his father. Periods of attempts to introduce market economy and periods of attempts to suppress it. And talking about pure ideological kind of packaging, I would say, first of all, cynically, I don't believe that ideology seriously matters in North Korea. It's basically largely, not exclusively, but largely a smoke screen. To an extent, any ideology exists, it's a North Korean nationalism, state-centered North Korean nationalism, which does not necessarily include South Korea as a part of the same nation. However, talking about this smoke, which is used to create smoke screen, I would notice that on one hand, we have, of course, attempts to keep Chechnya and so on, but a minor revival of the communist ideology. If you look at the recent how would you say, statute of the Korean Workers' Party, you discover that they reintroduced a reference to communism as communist society, communist utopian society, as a final goal of the Korean Workers' Party, which is new, because such references were long deleted. I sort of explained by the need to justify ideologically and a kind of, well, I would say allies with China, but interaction with China, because it will be easier to sell North Korea as a communist state if they have an official reference to communism in one of their major official documents, as communism as a goal. But I would explain, I would expect probably more references to the communist tradition, socialist tradition, and the like. But once again, I would not overestimate all these references because it's basically a smoke screen. I don't take ideology seriously, frankly, in this country.
Thank you, Andrei. Jasper Brown, go ahead.
Cool.
Now can you hear me?
Okay, now.
Yes, no, it's okay.
Thank you,
go
sorry.
ahead.
Andre, I always like listening to you, but I also like to push back on you a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Partly because the way you look at things, you know, none of us know what's going to happen in the future. We always all have ideas, but we don't know what's going to happen. And these models that you look at, like Libya, etc., you know, I don't believe them. That's in the past. I'm looking forward what's happening today in North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm seeing, I think, is a pretty rapid falling apart of their state economic system, pretty rapid, especially their monetary system.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the last week, the prices of corn and rice have jumped in the outlying areas. I mean, like 30–40%. They're jumping all around. Prices are moving all over the place. Exchange rates are moving all over the place. I mean, I think they're losing control of their monetary system. Now, you can say that's just sort of capitalism creeping in, but I'm saying, boy, that doesn't look very stable to me. And it looks to me like logical people, I'm not predicting it, but I think it could happen. Logical people, rational people in North Korea, even Kim Jong-un, could decide, well, maybe we need to give in a little bit on this nuclear business in order to get more domestic economic stability. Nothing to do with South Korea, nothing to do with unifying the country. But hey, let's get a little bit more money in there for foreign exchange in our system here, so we can get control of these markets and reestablish some state control. Yeah. What's wrong with that kind of theory?
Well, first, I don't know the future. And maybe you are right, but just will say two things. I see two remarks in your statement. With one I largely agree with, another I largely disagree. You attracted attention to what's going right now. I deliberately didn't want to talk about it, but I would say that right now you are absolutely right. North Korean government is vulnerable. It's a short-term vulnerability, which is created not so much by the sanctions, but by their own overreaction to the COVID pandemics. Because of this mess, these corn prices, which nearly doubled in some areas over the last few months, a very strange mess with currency exchange rate, which is going down surprisingly, which shows that there is very little demand for foreign currency, and so on. All these things indicates a certain threat of instability. So, if the black swan, proverbial black swan, is going to arrive, it's probably going to arrive in the next year or so, because right now they are going through a very dangerous period. Maybe I am inclined to believe it's not going to last. I'm also inclined to believe that they themselves, by their own excessive quarantine measures, creating this problem. But the problem is real. I do agree with you. Right now, we are going through a period of turbulence, which can be last. Sooner or later, once the pandemics, once the fears about pandemics will go down, this threat will disappear. So, but I think first part. Second statement, yeah, just I try very briefly, yeah. And the second statement is that they want to do something about North Korea, nuclear weapons. First of all, I think they believe that nuclear weapons is a means of survival. So the people are not going to be bribed into committing suicide, because that man cannot be rich man. First, having said that, on top of that, right now, say a few years ago, they probably needed a deal on the nuclear issue which would never ever include denuclearization. It has always been out of question, but some deal to get foreign assistance and trade and aid. Right now they have China behind their back. They would like to diversify, but still they are under much less pressure than just a couple of years ago. So with China behind their back, they are even less inclined to search for the compromise. So the second part, if they are pressed, will they start thinking about some kind of deal on the new issue? And answer is not. But it's a good part of such type of argument.
Okay, Andrei, your internet access seems unstable. Go ahead.
Yeah, looks now okay. Looks now okay.
Okay,
Yes, I saw some
go ahead.
problems. Yeah, looks okay.
All right, thank
Yeah.
you, Andrei.
Yes, I just finished that. I said.
Okay.
Yeah, I finished.
Next one, Jacob Khan, are you there? Jacob,
Sir, yep.
go ahead.
So first of all, thank you, Dr. Kim, for this uncommon opportunity for a rising ninth grader to get involved in such a high-profile international proceedings on critically important issues on the Korean Peninsula. So hello, Dr. Lankov. Here's my question. What can be some specific tips you will give as currently rising high schooler in parts of writings about the Korean Peninsula issue? Why is writing so important?
If it's a high schooler and you want to do serious research on Korean issues, yeah? What would be the serious tips? Well, I have to know your background. I believe it's extremely, if you want, and your plans. If you want to do serious lifelong research of North Korean issues, first problem is, do you speak Korean? Do you read Korean well? If not, fix it. You have to have a very good command of Korean, because everything, there are areas where you can do serious study without sufficient language skills. Like say if you're doing South Korean economy, but if you don't read Korean well, it's not going to be a big deal. But if you're going to do North Korea, you have to have very good command of Korean language, first. Second, don't repeat the almost universal mistake of the South Korean scholars, who are usually remarkably poorly informed about the history of other communist countries, China, Russia, especially Eastern Europe. When they talk about North Korea, they very often say that this or that are uniquely North Korean, and they don't realize that this unique North Korean system was 50 years ago copied from, by the Russian order, copied from Poland, like if you know, story of the 1946 land reform. You can read works of the South Korean historians, largely left-leaning and sometimes slightly pro-North Korean, who will be telling you about this great and wonderful law created by Kim Il-sung. It was literal translation of a law which was compiled for Hungary in Eastern Europe and translated by translators in the Russian military command. Period. But these people, so second, do a lot of reading, even if you are not going to do history, especially if you're going to do history, about, yes. And if you're going to do, so language, Korean language, number one. Second, general background in the communist history, because most of this experience are extremely relevant. If you can do extra language, do Chinese. If you have a lot of time and exceptional linguistic skills, do Russian. If you are if you're a language genius, such order. Korean is a must, Chinese is desirable, Russian is a nice addition, especially if you are doing history, Japanese will not harm you. So, yes, and it's what I say, and read a lot of books about communist history, and yeah, try to get into a good university.
Very good. Thank you, Andrei. Now, Sid, it's your turn. Sid Hecker?
Yes, indeed, thank you. So, Andrei, how nice it is to see you. I miss your visits to Stanford.
Well, it's great to see you here, and I would like to see you eventually in your place. Unfortunately, at Stanford. Unfortunately, I have no idea when I'm going to be there again. Maybe early next year if it's lucky. Well, there are actually two questions. First, the question about the ideal outcome. You probably know what I'm going to say. I believe that right now, yes, you are unfortunately right. The world has changed. But I believe that basically your suggestion is still very good. No more bombs and no better ones. So the deal which is going to be achievable in future, in a rather distant future, I'm very pessimistic in the short term, this deal should include that North Koreans should surrender significant part of their research and development, as well as manufacturing equipment. A bottom deal. No talks about freezing, nothing about, say, stopping the centrifuges or whichever. Everything should be physically destroyed. Because we know that promises can easily be just thrown to the basket. Such things were done by the Americans, by the Russians, but especially by the North Koreans. So, physical destructions of facilities, as many facilities as possible. This is the first demand. Second, of course, no testing and no ICBM. And when we are talking about destruction of some physical equipment, we should talk not only about the centrifuges, not only about nuclear reactors, but also about ICBM. I'm not a big specialist in the rocket engines, but if you talk to the specialist, they say that there are some very expensive pieces of equipment which are necessary to make an engine. So, such pieces of equipment should be destroyed or maybe surrendered. It will still mean that the North Koreans will keep some research and development and manufacturing capabilities, but limited. They will have enough, probably, nuclear weapons to deter the United States, or also China, because they do care about China. China is at the same time a great hope and a great threat to North Koreans. So they care about China, but of course their major concern, 95%, 90%, 95%, is the United States. So if they surrender a lot, they will still have enough nuclear weapons, enough delivery system. It probably will secure them against an American attack or Chinese attack or something they are afraid even more. That is, a foreign intervention into some kind of domestic crisis. So, basically, it's a goal, I would say. Right now, I think North Koreans are not very happy, not very inclined to do such a deal. Well, Donald Trump, I know it's a touchy political issue, and most people present here are Americans, so most of you probably have strong political opinions and will take these references to the American politics personally. Well, it's understandable. Don't talk to me about Mr. Putin, or I can go ballistic. But in this case, we can say that Mr. Trump used to be a perfect madman from the famous Nixon madman theory. Was he going to attack North Korea during all this fire and fury talk or not? Nobody knew. But he did look like a person who was going to strike. He terrified everybody. I don't expect that they were basically willing to make some concessions back then just in order not to be attacked by Donald Trump. But I don't believe that any American president in the foreseeable future will be sufficiently crazy, will look sufficiently crazy enough to terrify them again. This is probably good news for the for a majority of the Americans, not to have a president who looks so strange and who behaves in that way. But if we talk about North Korea right now, without a terrifying Donald Trump hanging around, they will demand for a lot of concessions, and conditions are going to be hard. Well, and going to the second part of the question, about nuclear accident, about bad luck. Judging by what the communist government in China did say in 1976 when they had a massive earthquake near Beijing, judging by what the Soviet government did in 1948 when they had Ashgabat earthquake, or a big nuclear incident in Chelyabinsk in the late 1950s, I think, 1957. So basically we have a kind of precedence. So we have seen how communist governments, which basically were significantly more rational than North Korean governments, behaved when they had such an accident. Well, when something like that, something big, seriously bad happened, first of all, they wanted silence. If something happened, in North Korea, it probably will be the same. If some big accident happens, they will remain silent for a while. Even if we have all indications about some massive accident, they will try to keep everything under control and under a carpet. For a while, they will not report it to the media, they will not ask probably for foreign assistance, at least initially, and without foreign assistance, it will soon become a really serious disaster. It was a bit like, the 1976 China earthquake or many other same cases. They probably initially will have some illusions that they can be quite successful with handling the problem, and quite likely the situation will get out of control. So it's not good. But there are good news too. The North Korean government has a remarkable ability to control the domestic movement, and this probably helps. They basically can ensure that their orders are followed by the general population. But I would say basically if something happens, they will try to push it under carpet, to try pretend as if everything is normal, and then only after they lose control, they will probably ask for help. And it's not good, because if it happens, a lot of people are going to die.
Thank you, Andrei. Tom Kim, please. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, hi, Dr. Lankov. It's been a long time since you and I were in the same studio talking to Korean audience in Seoul. Now, I was going to draw your attention to the recent summit between Biden and Putin in Geneva, and their outcome of their summit in terms of its impact or implications for North Korea's nuclear program and cyber activity and human rights situation in North Korea. One of the things you talked about is the potential discussion or undertaking of talks on arms reduction form of it. And as you know, Biden and Putin have agreed to build on extended New START to control their arms development, and what implication this might have on North Korea's nuclear program. Your position is very clear that to not to anticipate any progress on the front of denuclearization of North Korea. You said it's not going to happen anyway. But my question, can there be peace or peaceful peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula without denuclearization or some source of control of North Korea's nuclear program? So if North Korea has some interest in, and I think they showed their interest before having responding to international call or somebody's suggestion on the controlled arms control type of talks. Now, I want to bring in the potential role of Russia in this equation. You talked about the Sino-American competition or confrontation nowadays. Where does Russia stand on this? Is there any role or interest or potential contribution that Russia can make in terms of bringing North Korea and the United States and the international community to get all together into a forum of arms control talks along the line both Russia and United States have been talking about?
Thank you, Tom.
Well, actually, there are two questions, but let's say let's start from the Russian part. I believe Russia can do and is willing to do very little because Russia is comfortably sitting at the back seat, letting Chinese and Americans drive. For Russia, Russia is not supportive of the North Korean nuclear program. Neither is China, because actually there is very simple reason. Both Russia and China are members of the exclusive nuclear club, and they don't want proliferation, because proliferation is undermining their unique strategic position in the modern world. However, for Russia, the North Korean nuclear issue is not a major issue. Actually, it's a very secondary issue. So I would say it would be just a minor exaggeration to say that Russian policy in regard to North Korea is written in Beijing, because Russian interests are very similar to the interests of China, but Russian stakes are much lower than stakes of China. Like China, Russia wants first stability, second division, third denuclearization. Denuclearization is a very distant third. So if there is some kind of joint measures, joint policies, Russia will participate, especially if China participates. But it's not going to take initiative, and its actual impact on the situation in North Korea is negligible. Let's not forget that Russian official trade with North Korea roughly 50 times, 50 times smaller than Chinese trade with North Korea. And all attempts to revive economic interaction between Russia and North Korea have ended in very spectacular failures. And there are good reasons. I simply have no time to talk why it was unavoidable. Talking about Russian role as a kind of participant in talks, until recently, I would say that Russia can be a good mediator for all kinds of multilateral diplomacy. But the world has changed, and not for the better. With the current state of relations between the United States and China, this type of triangle relations, with this current type of relations, I don't expect. Sorry, that's just phone. Yeah, yes, I don't expect that Russia is going to be seen as sufficiently neutral and acceptable, I would say, chair country in such multilateral talk. So in the long run, yes, Russia can be a reasonable mediator, but it will not happen until the relations between Russia and the US will significantly improve. Not just an occasional summit, but significant improvement. And given the, above all, Russian internal domestic dynamics, I don't expect it to happen anytime soon. I'm quite pessimistic in this regard as well.
Thank you, Andrei. Gil Grossman, it's Gil?
Yes.
Go ahead.
This timing is just perfect because the triangle Russia, China, and the United States, as it influences this process, seems to me to be where I take the most exception to remarks, Andrei. although I found great benefit in what you write, including following your writings in Russian over the years. I have to say that I think you are too optimistic in dealing with the past of China and Russia and how they could have contributed to a solution to this problem, given what they have been thinking about the nature of the problem, sometimes not spelled out as directly as they might. Looking at their sources, I would argue that we have been at an impasse for a long time with little prospect of working out any kind of major progress in terms of how these three powers can work together. My own specific question to you that I had prepared was to go further back into the Russian response over the last, well, since January 2003, when Russia tried to play a mediator role. I was in Moscow at the time listening to the report of the minister who had just come back from Pyongyang. I recall the sort of disappointment, but the hope that Russia really could be a major figure in transforming this whole situation. But I think the nature of the Cold War has been building for quite a while, and the different assumptions about the Korean Peninsula, the history of the Korean Peninsula, and the conditions that would be acceptable in terms of great power relations on the peninsula and South Korea are such that there's been less reason for the kind of hope that you suggested, either in Russia playing a role or in China until just a few years ago, being willing to do more to try to figure out a solution to this.
I would agree that I said that I think I said I did say maybe and eventually at most. So I believe that there is currently I would say no hope. In the long run, we'll see. Talking about China, and the same is applicable to Russia, we have sort of contradiction. Because on one hand, China and Russia are not happy about North Korean nuclear weapons. I can explain why. With China, we have one major reason I already said. They want to remain highly privileged members of the world community because they have absolute deterrence. Few other countries have. But on top of that, for China, we have one additional reason. For Russia, another additional reason. If China has a fear of nuclear domino in East Asia, because if North Korea is sort of tacitly recognized as a nuclear country, sooner or later some other countries in the region will try to develop nuclear weapons. It doesn't look likely right now or next 5 or 10 years, but if you think long term, we are talking about nuclear Japan, nuclear South Korea, nuclear Taiwan, nuclear Vietnam, nuclear Myanmar, even if it sounds strange. And nearly all neighbors of China will develop nuclear weapons against China. So Chinese are not happy about it. But the politics is usually not a choice between good and bad. It's a choice between bad and worse. So they see that they don't want to deal with a nuclear North Korea because it creates a dangerous precedent. And because they don't like North Korea. However, they need to have a stable buffer zone. And they need to keep Korean Peninsula stable and divided. Is far greater than they need, well, threats, possible threats which are created by instability of in Korea or unification of Korea. Such threats are far greater than threats which are likely to be created by nuclear North Korea. So, and the same is applicable to Russia. And Russia, we have a different stuff. Russia has additional reason to be dislike proliferation. Because of all officially recognized nuclear countries, Russia has the smallest nominal GDP. Russia has serious problems with soft power.
So for Russia, the relative significance of the nuclear deterrent or nuclear force is greater than for any other great nuclear power. And of course, it doesn't want proliferation.
May I add one thing to my question?
Yeah.
The word stable, that China and Russia want stability, I find that the most misleading word that's been used for a long time. I think the instability caused by North Korea's disruption of the geopolitics in the region is seen as a positive because of its impact on the U.S. and U.S. relations with its allies. And so I don't think stability is the right word used in this context. But go on, I will stop there.
Yeah, I disagree. I think that China doesn't want instability because, and Russia too, but in this case, China is a key player. Because of very one reason. It creates very good justification for the increase of the US presence in the region. Even more, North Korean provocations have finally succeeded in reviving pro-American feelings in North Korea on the great scale. 20 years ago, 15 years ago, there was a significant increase in anti-American feelings in South Korean society, which culminated around 2004 presidential elections. And for a brief while, even when North Koreans torpedoed Cheonan, there was a significant number of the South Koreans who believed that it was a government provocation of their own government, or at least manipulation. And then North Koreans decided to shell Yeonpyeong-do Island. And since then, it was a downhill trend. America is madly loved by the South Korean public now. Why? To a very large extent. It's not the only reason, because of the North Korean provocations. American presence in the region looks very solid because of North Korean provocation. Frankly, I don't see what China gets from North Korea. China wants North Korea, which would be quiet, would be sitting there, and basically this is what they're getting right now. I would bet that the major reason why Mr. Biden was not greeted in his new job with a nice ICBM launch is because the Chinese ambassador in Pyongyang has definitely made clear this is not what China wants. And now North Korea is way too dependent on China. So I completely disagree. China needs North Korea, which will be stable. Because all these attempts to bite Americans backfire. They are mighty good for North Korea, they are bad for China. Because it will increase alliances, strengthen the alliances, and it will create very good justification for the increase of the US presence in the region. Same is applicable to Russia, but once again, for the Russians, stakes are very much smaller and interests are far more complicated. Yeah.
Thank you. Richard White.
Thank you. Yeah, great discussion on Russia. If I could just ask a related question, which is what extent there's been recently Russia-Chinese coordination regarding North Korea?
I honestly, I'm not in position to answer this question. Honestly, I don't know. But I think that coordination is quite simple. Basically, because major interests, the triple interest of, as I said, stability, division, denuclearization, with denuclearization being essentially a small footnote, because this agreement, these major interests are in agreement, and because for China stakes are so much higher, and because the relations are not exactly equal, I think that major decisions are made in China, in Beijing, and basically then Russia just generally is usually inclined to follow the Chinese policies on this issue. But it's largely speculation. I'm not in position to say anything kind of more concrete.
Thank you. Jaebum Kim from Seoul.
Thank you.
Jaebum, go ahead.
Yes, I've been very much impressed by the explanation from Professor Lankov, which brings me to ask you the most fundamental question that if we want any kind of solution to the North Korean nuclear issue, maybe we must harness another kind of top-down approach, which requires some change in Beijing first, not from Pyongyang. I have heard that there are some rumors from the previous administration of Trump that the United States wanted approach to Beijing for the establishment of the Communist Party. Then history may tell that any change in mainland China would have some trickling down effect on the Korean Peninsula. So I think it's time for us to change our approach from Pyongyang first to Beijing first.
Well, what can I say? China is a key player. It has been the case for the last 15 years, but it's increasingly so. The reason for basically everything which is happening in Korea and around Korea now is to a very large extent determined by China. Not everything, but almost everything. So, yeah. But I don't see how China can be changed. Because China was willing to cooperate on the North Korean issue in 2017, 16, 17. They wanted to be tough because they were also terrified by Mr. Trump. They were sort of afraid that Donald Trump was serious about starting a war. They didn't want a war. And so they were willing to cooperate and be really seriously tough on North Korea. They were seriously tough. But right now, I don't see how it can be achieved. So yes, on balance, I do agree. All these issues should be negotiated with China. But I don't see any chances to the Chinese line. And political changes in China, well, it probably will happen eventually, but God knows when.
Thank you. Okay, Nobuo Tanaka from Tokyo. Are you out there?
Yeah, yes. Thank you.
Nobuo, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. It was so interesting that your observation and about your experience in North Korea. My question from Japan is that we are very much concerned about the short-range missiles over Japan. I mean, even without the ICBM development, we are under the threat, of course, of North Korea. So, in what kind of situation do you think North Korea will shoot? That maybe American bases in Japan or not, but what kind of crisis do you think this risk will increase?
Any kind of military confrontation. If North Koreans believe themselves to be attacked, which does not necessarily mean they are actually attacked. I don't think they are crazy to start a war because they are not crazy. They are brilliant Machiavellians. But having said that, if they believe themselves to be under attack, American attack, South Korean attack, they can start shooting. But part of the story is that it does not necessarily mean they are actually under attack. Second, what I'm afraid is a domestic crisis. Essentially, we are probably, I don't believe the chances for a North Korean revolution or popular uprising are high. But if we have still a popular revolution, or if we have some warlords fighting one another, say Kim Jong-un suddenly dies, they have already made preparations to deal with this issue, which is very good news. I admire him. I admire Kim Jong-un for, for what? He sort of approved preparations for his own possible death. how many dictators can do it? He's probably better than he looks. But maybe it's not a good news for everybody around, including us. But anyway, they made preparation, but if he suddenly dies, we can easily imagine, say, I don't know, Chveryong group fighting Kim Yo-jong group and so on and so on. And in such a mess, they can basically do silly things, either to basically misjudgment or just out of desperation. So you should be afraid, and South Koreans should be afraid. And frankly, I don't see good advice. I think the only advice for the Japanese and South Koreans will be, if and when Americans start negotiating these issues, make sure that Americans will keep your interest in mind as well. Because there was, especially under Donald Trump, a real threat that they would negotiate ICBM, leaving short-range missiles and medium-range missiles as it is. And it still can happen, but it's up to the Japanese diplomacy and South Korean diplomacy to reduce the risks. But not a good news. Again, when I said we have to live with nuclear North Korea, sorry, I'm now sitting in downtown Seoul and hope to stay here for the rest of my life, at least until I'm seriously old. So it's not that I'm happy about it, but I'm just saying that this is how world looks like.
Thank you. You are welcome to Tokyo, by the way.
It's another country. I cannot say I want to go to Tokyo as much as I want to go to Washington.
Thank you.
Yes,
Andrei, it's good to see you again. James Minnick from Honolulu-based Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Enjoyed the questions and the comments from the group. I think many would agree that national security is imperiled by a nuclear weapons-capable North Korea that harbors animus towards the United States and its allies, right? So, as it's likely that we will affect Pyongyang's intentions towards Washington before we affect its nuclear weapons capabilities,
I would say that, you know, when you said that they are hostile to the United States, you know what I will say, something strange. I'm not sure. You know what I mean. They have only one ally, that is themselves. When I'm asked about their long-term dreams, I would say they have two long-term dreams, not even goals, but dreams. One dream is to have Korea unified under their control, to drive Americans away, to blackmail Americans into remaining passive and not protecting South Korea and taking over the South. One day. It's their dream. I'm not saying it's their goal, it's a dream. And they have another dream, to become allies of the United States of America, to become a base, a kind of unthinkable American aircraft carrier next to China, and being paid handsomely for such a job. These dreams are not compatible. You cannot do both. But well, first of all, you can dream about this and that, and then they hope that they will eventually get one of these two things. So I don't think they are very hostile to the United States. Their approach to the outside world is highly pragmatic. Highly pragmatic. They are hostile to China, they are hostile to Russia, they are hostile to Indonesia because they see the world as a zero-sum game. And they care about their interest only. So if they decide, if they don't have any kind of ideological hatred against the United States, this is what they say in their propaganda, but they can switch the tone immediately. So,
thank you.
Thank you. Well, Andrei, this is a great discourse.
Yeah.
And Tom, the way you look to me, you have something else to raise to Andrei again? Tom Kim? It's a bonus.
Oh, Well, his view that North Koreans will never give up their nuclear weapons is well known, and he has a good basis to believe that. But let's make you sure that not everyone agrees with that view.
What I always say, keep trying. Miracles happen. But it's very unusual. So again, when I say that, when I talk about the compromise and everything, it should become. I don't mind. But as I have said, I've been seeing this soap opera not exactly for 37 years, because this nuclear soap opera began about 30 years ago. But I have been watching these attempts to get something done for 30 years. And I hope to do enough exercise and diet control to watch it another 30 years. And I don't expect that it will be much different. So yes, I don't say we should not try. I think we should try to get denuclearization, but I believe we are not going to get it. So we have to think about first some compromise on the nuclear issue. And we should think about ways to change North Korea from inside. Issue I have not even raised today, but it's probably equally important.
Thank you. Casper?
Yeah, I really like your very last point. And I'd suggest that you sort of, maybe all of us, rethink this denuclearization into what do we really not like about North Korea? It's not the nuclear issue.
Mm-hmm.
The nuclear issue is a symptom of the problem. The problem is their socialist communist system.
Mm-hmm.
And in a really funny way, I've been watching this for as long as you have, Andrei. In a really funny way, the nuclear issue is destroying, killing socialism in North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
It's moved to the market in a pretty remarkable way, only halfway, it hadn't finished. But if you look back 25 years ago, it was a much worse country than it is now, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, this nuclear issue is killing them. I don't like the nukes, of course, but I probably more dislike their socialist system. So if we can reorient the question to be asking, what will it take to get rid of North Korean socialism? That might be a more valuable goal for us, or at least analytically to look at. So that's what I think. And you are really wonderful
Mm-hmm.
at that topic. You really are.
Yeah, I see. I do agree. It's something I did not even raise this issue because it was. First of all, I'm sort of disappointed because, frankly, a sort of personal. I believe that something like, say, information activities, broadcast, digital stuff, everything, bringing knowledge about outside world, training, exchanges, changing the minds. And it was easy to do. It was very easy to do 10 or 15 years ago. And back then I was quite noisy and significantly more active than now, including Washington. I talked to a lot of people. I had very good access, but very little actual results. A lot of people were willing to talk to me up to the highest ever level, but the results were not zero, but very modest. And then eventually I understood what was going on. It's a long story. I probably should not take. It would take too much time. It's a completely different topic. I'm now sort of disappointed because we had a very good opportunity to change North Korea. Unfortunately, Kim Jong-un does not want us to change his country. And his father was significantly less efficient in keeping the situation, ideological and political situation, under control. Kim Jong-un is very efficient. So we lost many opportunities. And now, I'm not saying it should not be done. Of course it should be done. But I'm now significantly less optimistic about chances and outcomes and above all time frames. Something which could be relatively easily done 15 years ago now will take much more time and efforts and money. But it should be done anyway. I just feel sorry about missed opportunities, say of 2005, 2010. And by the way, they were missed, I will be sarcastic, one of many reasons. I can write sort of analysis. Maybe it's too early because there are some few things which are mildly confidential, but maybe eventually I will write why it didn't work then. And one of the reasons was that people were so hopeful about nuclear solution, just beyond the corner. Hardliners were saying sanctions are beginning to bite. Wait for a while, they will come begging basically us to stop sanctions with their nukes. Optimists say, we finally found way to their hearts, we will persuade them. Of course, nothing worked, neither hard line nor soft line. And people paid very little attention to things which would probably produce much better results. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you. Sean Creamer, do you have an add-on question? Go ahead, Sean.
Yes, sir. Going back to your North Korean dreams, I guess what advice would you give to policymakers in both South Korea and the United States on approaches to take to perhaps realize a future where there are, I guess, decreased tensions between the North and the South?
Problem is that it's very difficult to decrease tensions. It's something I wanted to mention when another question was asked. I believe it was essentially Mr. Tom Kim who asked this issue about peaceful relations. I'm very skeptical. The problem is that North Korean government needs a measure of tension in order to justify its policy, to keep population under better control. They need to maintain a certain level of tension. Of course, if South Koreans are willing to pay systematically significant amount of money, like it was done in the days of sunshine policy, and just to make clear, I don't mind. I'm a sunshineman myself. I'm supportive of the sunshine policy because of many reasons. But having said that, basically, as long as South Korean money are being pumped into North Korean economy, they can be quiet. But otherwise, they're going to be occasionally stage some kind of provocations or just maintain level of tension because they need it for the domestic purposes. But having said that, talking about advice, what I would say to the American policymakers, first of all, I would say, keep trying to get denuclearization with full understanding it's not going to happen. Number two, work on a Hanoi-style compromise and be prepared for hard bargaining. Number three, so the idea is to surrender partial surrender of nukes and nuclear equipment in exchange for sanctions lifted. Number three, don't trust North Koreans and remember they are not trusting you and forget the ideas about trust building. They are not going to work with North Korea. Just hard stuff. Instead of promises, just get their equipment. But be expected to be treated the same way by the North Koreans. Number four, be prepared for a possible talk to China about North Korea, but be certain that price for Chinese concessions are going to be very steep now, still keep talking. Number five, be prepared for regime collapse or any kind of emergency in North Korea. Chances are not high, but it might happen and it's necessary to have some plans in order. Well, it's what and number six, probably the single most important point. Keep information kind of scouts called there is another strategic communication operations in regard to North Korea, which is broadcast, use of computer technology and everything to spread knowledge about the outside world. And maybe number seven, which is related actually to number six, much closer than most people imagine, exchanges with North Korea, inviting North Koreans, inviting children of the North Korean elite, giving them scholarships to study, not necessarily in the United States, Singapore will do, even Vietnam will do, and so on. Yeah, it's what I would say. And finally, number 8 in bold script, don't expect easy solution, don't expect quick fixes. It's probably going to last for 25 or 45 or 75 years.
Thank you, Andrei. Any add-on question? Bruce Bennett?
I guess yes,
Okay.
you hear me?
Good.
The only add-on I would add, Andrei, is question of, so what do you see as the key instabilities now in North Korea?
We have already discussed, first of all, overreaction to the pandemics, because they are probably, as far as I know from reasonably reliable confidential sources, China has a great stockpile of stuff, including humanitarian aid, free stuff. They are willing to ship to North Korea, but North Koreans are not getting it, or really getting only part of it, not everything. They have a lot, they are getting only part. So their overreaction to pandemics, which can provoke an outbreak of famine and some kind of domestic disturbances. It's the only short-term threat. Second, Kim Jong-un's health. He is seemingly on diet and lost about 10 kilos over last months or 1.5 months, which is good, but he is in a really bad physical shape. So he might, and obviously there are many signs indicating that he has serious health problems. If he dies, the transition period can be very tough and dangerous. It's number two. Well, and of course there is always a risk, as we have seen in the Arab Spring, of some kind of minor incident developing into something big. If you remember, Arab Spring began from a small brawl between a police officer and a fruit seller, and we had a massive crisis in the Middle East. So such things happen, but right now, I think because of the Chinese position, chances of such an outbreak from below are not very high. So if they survive pandemics, and once again, these pandemics, they're shooting their own feet, frankly. They are overreacting. But if they survive this period, I think that they will enter the period of stability, with the major threat being only health of Kim Jong-un himself. Because with Chinese aid, China will make sure that people will have their corn, and secret police officers will have their pork, so situation will stay under control.
Thank you, Andrei. Is Sick Hacker still there? Sick?
He has left, I've noticed.
Okay, you noticed. Good. Very good. Well, Andrei, it was a great discourse.
Yes. Yeah.
And ladies and gentlemen, the meeting is adjourned.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we'll have 1 month break.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me, and goodbye. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get back to you.
Yes.
Andrei. Yeah. Take care, everybody. Thank you.